Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 18 May 2024. My essay, The Coming Coeval Age, has appeared in the Isonomia Quarterly for summer 2024. Last year, I contributed an essay to the initial number of that journal. As with my recent paper in the Journal of Big History, a complexity ladder for big history, this most recent essay isn't narrowly about philosophy of history, but there are many philosophy of history themes in it. The journal's interest in the theme of isonomia was my point of departure for considering the institutional structure of civilization at the largest conceivable scales. So, what is isonomia? Just from the roots of the word, we can gather that it means the same law everywhere. There's a passage in Book 3 of the Histories of Herodotus known as the Constitutional Debate, in which three speakers argue for the best form of government, with these three being monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. The terminology changes a bit from author to author, but this is a consistent across the Greek world. So here is the first of the three speakers in Herodotus advocating for isonomia in the constitutional debate. Quote, the first speaker was Otanes, and his theme was to recommend the establishment in Persia of democratic government. I think, he said, that the time has passed for any one man amongst us to have absolute power. Monarchy is neither pleasant nor good. You know to what lengths the pride of power carried Cambyses, and you have personal experience of the effect of the same thing in the conduct of Magus. How could one fit monarchy into any sound system of ethic when it allows for a man to do whatever he likes without any responsibility or control? Even the best of men raised to such a position would be bound to change for the worst. He could not possibly see things as he used to see them. The typical vices of a monarch are envy and pride. Envy because it is a natural human weakness, and pride because excessive wealth and power lead to delusion that he is something more than a man. These two vices are the root cause of all wickedness. Both lead to acts of savage and unnatural violence. Absolute power ought by rights to preclude envy on the principle that the man who possesses it has also at command everything he could wish for. But in fact, it is not so, as the behavior of kings to their subjects proves. They are jealous to the best of them merely for continuing to live and take pleasure in the worst. And no one is readier than a king to listen to talebearers. A king, again, is the most inconsistent of men. Show him reasonable respect, and he is angry because you do not abase yourself before his majesty. Abase yourself, and he hates you for being a toady. But the worst of all remains to be said. He breaks up the structure of ancient tradition and law, forces women to serve his pleasure, and puts men to death without trial. Contrast this with the rule of the people. First, it has the finest of all names to describe it, equality under law. And secondly, the people in power do none of the things that monarchs do. Under a government of the people, a magistrate is appointed by lot and is held responsible for his conduct in office, and all questions are put up for open debate. For these reasons, I propose that we do away with the monarchy and raise the people to power. For the state and the people are synonymous terms, unquote. And after that, there are speakers who enter into the debate to defend oligarchy and monarchy. And these three forms of government, the monarchical, the oligarchical, and the democratic, are, as I said earlier, a perennial theme of Greek political thought that continues to echo through the history of Western civilization and is still a basis of our discussion of politics today. Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics, for example, goes into some detail on these three types of constitutions. After sending off my essay to Isonomia Quarterly, I realized that one of the fundamental ambiguities about the idea of isonomia, and I would have included a footnote on this if I'd thought of it sooner, is the ambiguity implicit in speaking in terms of the same law. What is it that is the same when we speak of the same law? Well, the same law could mean that every particular law would apply to every particular person, or the same law could mean that the totality of the body of law applies to the totality of the population. And a body of law might involve different laws that apply differently to different persons, so that the second of the two senses does not entail the first of the two sentences. If you read my essay, you'll find that I argue that the Greeks understood isonomia in the latter sense, and I won't repeat my argument or cite the sources that I cited in that. You can go to the essay if you're curious. But But the fact that we might interpret a fundamental political idea in different ways poses the question of how these fundamental ideas outlined in antiquity apply to us today, and if they do apply, how they ought to apply now and in the future. And looking into the future, how will these traditional ideas be interpreted in future iterations of human society that might differ quite considerably from the world we inhabit today? How are we to understand isonomia within the context, for example, of a spacefaring civilization? Or for that matter, how are we to understand any classical Greek political theory in the context of future changes to society? For Westerners, this is our heritage, and how this tradition adapts or is adapted to changed conditions will give shape to the ongoing tradition of Western civilization. In my essay, I suggest that on Earth to date, the expansion of political regimes has constituted what I call synchronic isonomia, when societies are distributed synchronically, that is to say, when they interact in the present across geographical distances. In a specifically legal context, this means the iteration of a body of law across a region of space. The possibility of what Frank White calls large-scale space migration could initially constitute synchronic expansion on a scale greater than would ever be possible on Earth. But if continued, it would eventually cross a threshold of what I call diachronic isonomia. That is to say, when societies are distributed diachronically over time. In a specifically legal context, again, this means that iteration of a body of law, that is to say, the same law, over a period of time. The strange and even seemingly paradoxical aspect of this way of thinking is that the human scale of time could be distributed over a much larger cosmological scale of time while retaining its character as distinctively human history. I'll try to explain how this could come about, but first I want to point out a peculiarity of terrestrial history that we haven't seen as peculiar. We are familiar with the idea that we see the universe from a particular point of view because we see it from the surface of a planet. Our planetary perspective has been the focus of the Copernican revolution, which has taught us that our apparent centrality in the universe is an artifact of our limited perspective. The Copernican revolution taught us to transcend our planetary perspective and to see the universe from a non-terrestrial perspective. But there's another aspect of the Copernican revolution that we haven't yet explored, and that is seeing history from a non-terrestrial perspective. Part of this non-terrestrial perspective is simply to understand that just as we are not in the center of space, we are also not in the center of time. But there's more to it than this. Einstein's theory of relativity has made it possible for us to see time in a new way. In many of my episodes, I've talked about the need to address the disconnect between the philosophies of time and the philosophies of history. History is constructed out of time, so a radical reconceptualization of time suggests a radical reconceptualization of history, and the theory of relativity is such a radical reconceptualization of time. But many of the influences of relativity and gravity upon time are not usually noticed on a terrestrial scale, and all human history to date has occurred on a terrestrial scale. We can see the effects of relativity when we look into the cosmos and use instruments to observe cosmological distances over which relativity is relevant, and to observe bodies so dense that they change the structure of space-time. To date, our technologies have allowed us to measure the relativity of time under the influence of acceleration and gravitation, but we may at some point in our history develop technologies that allow us to interact with the universe at a scale at which relativity will change our history. When this eventuality comes to pass, we will eventually be forced to notice things about our history that hadn't previously been seen as at all problematic. Our history to date has been the simplest possible history because it has all transpired on Earth. That is to say, Earth is our inertial frame of reference for all historical events. There are relativistic effects within this inertial frame of reference, but they can only be detected by instruments of extreme precision. The influence of relativity lies below the threshold of human perception, that is, human perception without instrumentation. For example, every planet drags its space-time around with it as it rotates, which is known as frame dragging. And even the relatively crude instruments of previous centuries could detect the perihelion precession of Mercury, which is an observable relativistic perturbation of the orbit of Mercury. This was first observed and noted to diverge from Newtonian predictions in 1859, and it wasn't until general relativity was experimentally confirmed that we had an explanation for that. It remained an anomaly for all those decades between 1859 and 1919, you could say. But these relativistic effects are well below the threshold of impacting human history, even if they can be observed with instruments. Technologies, however, could change this. Relativistic space travel would be such a technology, and this has been made famous by the so-called twin paradox. The twins paradox is invoked with the greatest effect by the use of individuals to illustrate the differences between two clocks and two different inertial frames of reference, usually presented to us as a set of twins. This has been called a paradox because it was initially simply thought to be impossible. Now we just know it's a strange feature of the universe, but there's no reason to think of it as being contradictory. And we saw the use of individuals, not twins, illustrating the poignancy of time dilation in the film Interstellar, where it's a father and daughter who are separated, with the father experiencing an accelerated inertial frame of reference so that he returns still as a young man to find his daughter dying as an old woman. This is great for drama, but this isn't how any relativistic space settlement effort is going to play out unless someone purposefully arranges something like this as a stunt. So let's talk about a simple example. Suppose a space settlement on some other planet of several thousands of individuals, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, something like a small city. And you get to that, where the settlement is, by relativistic space travel, which could be tens or hundreds or thousands of light years from Earth. The passengers on the starship in their accelerated inertial framework will experience time dilation, and they will preserve the cultural milieu of Earth as it was upon their launch. When they establish their settlement, there will be two human histories that bifurcate at the point in time when the Interstellar Settlement Initiative was inaugurated. However, the larger population on Earth will continue to drive cultural evolution at a far faster rate than in the settlement. While in the settlement, human beings will be subjected to radically different selection pressures than those that prevailed on Earth, and there will also be a smaller community likely to retain the cultural milieu they possessed when they left Earth. Here, then, we have two distinct human histories, offset in time by the discontinuity of the relativistic time travel from Earth to the location of the settlement. For example, if the Earth and the settlement are 100 light years apart, there would be a temporal discontinuity of a century. Life would go on at Earth, and a century later, things would be different. But a century later, the settlement would just be founded on the basis of Earth's culture of a century before. This is a kind of historical complexity that we do not have today, but which could happen in the future. So now imagine not one settlement, but 100 settlements or 1,000 such settlements, each representing a temporal discontinuity from Earth's proportional to its distance from Earth in light years. 100 settlements of 10,000 persons each would be an effort involving only 1 million persons, which is a very small proportion of the total human population. Earth wouldn't even notice the absence of 1 million people today. Further, imagine travel among these settlements by relativistic spacecraft, and then the history of those who travel between settlements will be even more complex. In this context, depending upon the location of settlements relative to each other and the date at which the settlement initiative is undertaken, an individual could effectively time travel into the past by traveling outward from Earth to a settlement that preserves the historical milieu at Earth at a time of its departure. You could not return to Earth without finding yourself accelerated into the future and finding Earth significantly changed, but you could travel further outward to a settlement established from an earlier time in Earth's history. We get a similar, if a slower result, if we substitute sub-relativistic spacecraft in conjunction with artificially induced torpor or hibernation, space arcs, if you will. A slow boat to the stars would likewise preserve the culture of Earth from the time of its departure, with settlers being roused and resuming their lives once they reach the end of their journey, effectively cut off from a return to their familiar terrestrial milieu. But they would be able to visit other historical peer milieu if they were to take another slow boat further out into the cosmos. The kind of distributed temporality that I am describing would achieve its greatest extent and its greatest historical complexity in the case of interstellar expansion. However, something similar could be realized on Earth at a much smaller scale. Imagine a large-scale hibernation project on Earth, such that about 10,000 persons are involved, enough so that there could be a rotating crew of a dozen or so that stays awake to tend the rest to make sure everything goes off as it's intended. At some appointed time in the future, the whole community could be brought out of their hibernation, and they would bring with them the culture of Earth from the date when they entered into hibernation, but which is now displaced into Earth's future. This would make it possible for temporally distributed communities to appear on Earth without travel to other worlds or without the use of relativistic technology, although it still involves another technology, induced hibernation. And there are several science fiction stories with something like this as their approximate premise, with details changed. Whether through relativistic travel or human hibernation, historical communities could be preserved from all eras into some indefinite future. And in that indefinite future, these distinct historical communities would be synchronically present. This is what I call coevalism, when all ages of history are equally accessible. The idea of coevalism first occurred to me many years ago and not in connection to relativistic space travel. I was thinking about the increasing fidelity of recording technologies. Written language is the most rudimentary form of recording technology, and it allows us the most rudimentary form of time travel, which is being able to share in the thoughts of those long dead. Since the Industrial Revolution, technologies have become much more sophisticated with photographs, film, and sound recordings, and always with increasing fidelity to the original. The rapid growth of computer technology and telecommunications in recent decades has made us aware that if this arc of technological development continues, we will have nearly perfect fidelity recordings of everything going on in the present. But in addition to recordings, we could generate states of affairs that never existed in fact, as in fantasy and science fiction, or we could generate the milieu of the past, both with a degree of fidelity equal to that of the present. Computers are already sufficiently sophisticated to generate simple films at the present time, and the reconstruction of past milieu can be done without computers as well. In the original Westworld film of 1973, a past milieu was recreated using robots. Robotics hasn't yet achieved this level of realism, but we could do this today with human actors. And we may yet do so with robots when technology does catch up to that. So that's another technology in addition to relativistic space travel and artificial hibernation. And in fact, today we do this in a limited way. For example, theme parks recreate fantasy worlds populated with actors who make fantasy characters come to life. So coevalism can be realized at smaller scales in spacefaring civilizations, but it would be in a spacefaring civilization with relativistic space travel in which the possibilities of coevalism would come to their fullest expression. History is extraordinarily complex, but I said earlier that our terrestrial history is the simplest history possible given the space-time structure of the universe. It is when we begin distributing our civilization in cosmological time that historical complexity will cease to be a single linear continuum. The possibilities of spacefaring histories will be both facilitated and limited by technology. These possibilities will also be facilitated and limited by the actual space-time structure of the universe, which is a function of the distribution of matter in the universe. Just as terrestrial history has been shaped by oceans, mountain ranges, and rivers, cosmological history is shaped by stars, gravitation, and expansion, and human history that takes place within this cosmological context will be shaped by these forces. The point I want to make is that while human history is complex, we are not necessarily limited by the complexity of the single inertial frame of reference of our homeworld. When multiple inertial frames of reference are available to us, and travel between them is possible, the possible structures of history will dramatically expand, and with these possibilities, human experience will dramatically expand also. And I hope you can see how this will give a whole new meaning to the idea of a speculative philosophy of history. In the conventional distinction between analytical philosophy of history and substantive philosophy of history, the analytical philosophy of history is, according to Arthur Danto, philosophy applied to the special conceptual problems which arise out of the practice of history, while substantive philosophy of history is a philosophical account of the historical process itself. The same distinction has also been called the distinction between critical and speculative philosophy of history by William Drey, and the distinction between formal and material philosophy of history by Maurice Mandelbaum. In addition to the speculative philosophy of history that considers the historical process, we can also imagine a speculative philosophy of history that concerns itself with the implications of speculative states of affairs upon history yet to come. Many of the speculative states of affairs I can imagine involve human exploration and expansion into the cosmos. As I said earlier, this is the most dramatic embodiment of an age of coevalism, is when we have these technologies that allow us to explore the universe. And the speculative states of affairs we might encounter in the wider universe could involve scientific discoveries not yet made and technologies not yet built, the histories of life on other worlds and the histories of alien civilizations, as well as the histories that we will create for ourselves in the cosmos. It's a big universe, and we might discover any number of unlikely or unprecedented existence. In my episode on a complexity ladder for big history, I argued that there may be distinctive emergence from historical knowledge, that is to say, that the quantitative growth of historical knowledge may pass a threshold to become a qualitative change in historical understanding. What kind of emergence could these be? For example, an increase in the knowledge of our own history can change our understanding of ourselves. We're seeing this today with the use of the genetic record to reconstruct the sequence by which human beings distributed themselves across the earth. In this way, epistemic emergence reshape our past and our understanding of ourselves. Contrast these past emergence with the emergence that could arise from a temporally distributed civilization and the advent of coevalism. A temporally distributed civilization could also give rise to emergence in historical knowledge. The dawning realization of epistemic emergence yet to come in the future will shape our conception of what we can become, reshaping our future. And we will need these epistemic emergence from a history of a greater order of complexity so as to understand the more complex world coming into being and which our descendants will inhabit. Without these emergence, we would not be able to understand the more complex world arising out of these novel technologies and the world that they will bring into being. So the future of philosophy of history has, in my view, never been brighter. So thanks for listening.